Hi, welcome to the Daiku Podcast and Daiku Game Pitch. I'm Gary Stowe. Today I welcome Mark Barron, the creative mind behind Knight, which is a rules-light storytelling and role-playing game in the tradition of Arthurian romances. Mark, welcome.
Hi, how you going, Gary? Nice to meet you.
Well, it's fabulous to have you on the show, and we're going to be talking about your game on Knight, or called Knight, and it's on Kickstarter right now, and I think you're about halfway through your campaign, and you're already funded, and it's doing really well, and we're going to talk all more about it. But first of all, just tell us, how did you get started in this crazy little hobby, and then how did you get involved in actual game design?
Oh, okay. So I got started with role-playing probably around 2000s or so. I suppose I was always a kid interested in computer role-playing games, that sort of stuff. Baldur's Gate was one of those fundamental things. I was a youngish teenager when that first came out, got obsessed with it, and then found out mainly through reading the manual, because you remember back in those days, games had those giant chunking manuals to it. So I was reading the Baldur's Gate manual, and I thought, there's a lot of stuff in here that doesn't seem to be of any relevance whatsoever to the player. And I clued in eventually that Dungeons and Dragons was actually realistic. Here in Australia, there's always been players here, but knowing about it, that it even existed back in those days, was a little bit more difficult to come across. Anyway, so I read that book, that game manual, came across some friends and stuff, and we were interested, we were loving it, and bizarrely, a teacher at school handed us a bunch of second edition stuff and first edition stuff, and we read all of this stuff, and we went, wow, this is amazing. We really want to play, and this is all of the Dungeons and Dragons stuff, and but then we found a game store, and we went, wow, this is amazing. There's a game store that sells game stuff. And we went in there and we immediately bought the Dungeon Master's Guide, completely unable to play the game whatsoever, and having no knowledge of it or anything like that. My friend, he read the Dungeon Master's Guide cover to cover, still had no idea how to play the game, because this is 3rd edition that we're talking about, 3.0. So we went back to the game store and we asked the person there, and he gave us, and because we'd bought the Dungeon Master's Guide and got confused, he gave us like $10 off the Adventure Begins Here box, which immediately has a sample characters and that sort of stuff for 3rd edition. We sat in the back of a McDonald's and in a little booth and started rolling the dice out of the thing right there, reading the game. as we were playing. We were so excited about it, and I remember distinctly there was a goblin who had put a unicorn to sleep with sleep arrows, despite the fact that unicorns were immune to sleep. And that's probably where game design came from straight away, because my friend sort of took a step back from dungeon mastering, and I just launched myself in. So I've been the main GM for that little group. For years, and running Dungeons and Dragons type stuff. Didn't hear about any other games, didn't know about any other games for a very, very long time. I only ever heard about Dungeons and Dragons. I only ever played Dungeons and Dragons, and when we heard about other games, you sort of live in that Dungeons and Dragons mindset. So you go, well, how do we play this other cool sounding game in Dungeons and Dragons? So which was at that time, it was a mistake, but it was a mistake I couldn't have understood as a mistake at that time, because you just think, well, this is the game that we play, and these other ones, well, they're a bit weird and a bit kooky, and so we won't touch those too much.
I think there's a ongoing joke of indie game designers that go, hey, I've got this like really cool innovative game, and then all the 5e players go, well, I bet you I can make a hack of that for 5e, and like it, kind of defeats the purpose, right?
Yeah, 100% right there. But so that's the sort of mindset that I was in. But as a GM, I think every GM is a game designer. I guess unless you just read the published modules and run it straight out of those sorts of things. But I think every GM is a game designer if they make their own monsters, if they make their own adventures. They're designing their own game with the needs of their own players in mind. So you do that for a few years, and and then you start going, well, if I can make a dungeon, if I can make a dragon that's a bit different, if I can make a class, and then you just slowly push it. But I mean, that being said, though, it was another 15 years before I started actually making different games. And I came across the indie game design scene, oh, geez, maybe 2015 or so, probably a bit earlier, come to think of it. But even still, even in those days, you know, we'd moved on to 5th edition whenever that came out, and I started making little hacks of that, and I found out about drive-through RPG, and started making little things with that. I remember reading a blog from a fella called the Alexandrian, fairly well-known guy, and he talked about low-level play. I remember reading that years and years ago. And I thought, oh, that's a great idea. I loved it, loved the idea of it. And so I made a thing called zero-level gaming, or tier 0 gaming. I can't even remember it, so long ago. It's on Dungeon Masters Guild now, and it's about playing 0-level characters. And I went way back into those early editions and sort of had a look at how they did it back in the day. And there was this ancient one from way back about 0-level people on a pirate ship and getting, you know, shipwrecked and finding gold to be able to get up to 1st level. You know, that's like, you know, original D&D type stuff. Anyway, so I took that stuff and I sort of created this little hack of it. And I thought, hang on, you know, I don't think I'll make heaps of money out of this, but I enjoy this process. I enjoy playing this game of design that is going to have a great deal of fun with my friends. And in those games and in that time, I also created this thing because I'm basically lazy in all of my storytelling. Back in 3rd edition days, you could spend a lot of time making characters and making monsters and all that sort of stuff. You know, and adding skill points here and adding skill points there. And even then, I was just lazy, and lazy is not the right word. I was efficient. I was efficient by basically winging it. And I'd go, I don't know what this monster has, and I don't really want to look at the book for it, so I'm just going to make it up on the spot. And I'm gonna roll with that. And anyway, so this idea.
That's usually the zen of like GMing, right? Is when you have that feeling that I can just roll with it, and that's usually where the magic happens. Well, I digress, though. That's at least my opinion on it. But so you're making stuff on the fly, and that's kind of your attitude in GMing now. So how did you go from that to getting into Knight?
Well, that's my next thing. So what I created then with my little 0-level game back in the day was basically a structured story seed system where you'd roll a couple of die, and you'd find out, and it'd give you a story seed, just a word, something like family or monster or something like that, or tournament. And so I just created this list, which I stole initially. I've changed it a lot since then, from the Traveller Life Path system. So I stole that initially, and I moved it over and I changed it and broadened it out a lot. And then what I did from there is because I'm lazy, I wanted my friends to make the world for me, and then I just run with it from there and just improvise. And so what we started doing is just rolling this between our different adventures. We just add stuff to the world and tell these little stories about the world and about how and they weren't big stories, they were little stories. And that's the key part of Knight. That's the fundamental big thing that's going to make something that separates Knight out from its brethren, such as Pendragon and so on. So the core rules of Knight are pretty simple, but what sets it apart is the fact that everyone goes around the table. Everyone tells little stories about their characters family, about their fief, about the world around them. And they add to that world, and whatever is said becomes true. So when you and then you draw in a few little things like where your fief is and a couple of mountains and such. But as the campaign progresses, every little part of that map starts getting filled in with different places and adventures and so on. So as you're playing, you're going on adventures, you're going in, you do the thing, and then you come back to the fief phase. And in the fief phase, everyone starts telling the story of the world. in terms of how their characters view it, because one of the core parts of Knight is about having a family and being not just a single wandering knight, but the head of a fief, of having a family who all have their own interests and desires. I got excited.
And then here's a picture of you. I assume you were playtesting this at a convention,
No,
possibly.
Con, actually. So that was at the con. I got an award for that one, actually. So in that version, I played a what do they call them? You know, where you have like hundreds of players who can just show up and do a mega game. So I turned Knight into a mega game. So I used the core rules for Knight there. And then every person just showing up at my little convention booth would come up, and then we would get them to tell a story about the different houses. So we had like House Hedgehog and House Raven and House something else, and so they'd just pick a house, pick a character. We'd roll some dice, and then they would tell us the story. We would write it down, and then as the convention went on, those people would sort of, you know, drift around doing their own thing, and then they'd come back to find out what had happened to that character that they'd taken on. They also built their own knight and had their own little adventure and took a little card away. So yeah, that was just my so that was just before my first edition Kickstarter came out. So I was building up for that Kickstarter at that point. So yeah, people got pretty excited, and I've run that mega game since then. So
walk us a little bit through the rules here, because seems like it could be abstract, and I know some people are like, really, like, no, I need a little bit more structure. But so just walk us through how it works.
Okay, so there's two main rules. The first one is if you do something risky or there could be a consequence, you roll a d20 roll under check against the appropriate attribute. So the easiest one would be you're in a fight, you're fighting with some guy, and he's a threat to you in some way. You roll your d20 against the appropriate attribute, and because you will say, well, the round structure is important. So before I get into the round, I need to explain the round structure. Round structure goes like this: GM describes the situation, and then all of the players indicate what their goal is, what their action would be, and then you roll the dice, and then we go back around and we describe it. And I actually have the players describe their action. So when you get to describe what happens after the dice are rolled, you don't have that dissonance between what the GM says and what you say you do. So in a standard traditional initiative system, you know, you might say, I leap over the table and I smash this guy's, you know, head off. But then you roll a 1 of damage or you miss or something like that, right? And so then there's this back and forth. Well, with this different round system, it's sort of, it's more cinematic in the way that it works. So you go around, GMs describe things, and then you say what your intention is. If your intention would be risky or would have a consequence of some sort, then you roll a d20 under the attribute most attached to that. There's only 3 attributes, so might, prowess, and wit, and they could be applied to anything. Any of those could be applied to combat. If you're like, I want to trick the guy I want to trip him or pull him out of position, then you might use wit. If you're just like, I want to just come in there and bash him with my shield and hit him, then, you know, that would be vigor. Now, that being said, you say what your intention is, and then you roll the dice. You roll 2 dice if there's a risk, and the first one is that d20 roll under the attribute. If you roll under or equal, no consequence. You do the thing, and there isn't a consequence to you. If you roll over, there's a consequence, and that consequence might be the guy hits you back. It could be any type of consequence, though, such as, like, I might, you know, easily the first one is they're riding along and you get knocked off your horse, something like that. There is there's a thing called endurance, which is similar to hit points, but because endurance happens in all situations. It's not just in combat. So if you're lost in the woods and you're trying to find your way through and you suffer a consequence, your endurance will go down. And when that endurance hits 0, well, you're lost and that mission is done. In the same way that if your endurance went down in a battle and you're 0, well, you'd be out for the count. So I've got that endurance rule to just represent, well, how much more go do you have in you before you retire yourself. You could also die. That's also a possibility. Death is a part of this system because you have family members who will replace you. Anyway, the second part after your consequences is the effect die and the activity number. The GM just says the effect die. It says it's either a D4 up to a D12, and depending on the attributes your character has, their traits, that sort of stuff, and the narrative situation, you'll be rolling anywhere between that D4 and the D12. D4 and the D12. So you roll that number, and that represents how much work you've done towards the task you want to accomplish. So if you roll an 8 and the activity number is an 8, well, you've done the task. The GM also sets the activity number, and the activity number is anywhere between 5 and 40. So what happens there is the GM sets the activity number. Once all the players contribute enough effect die points to match that activity number, that is done. However, every round that is going on, there is more risk of consequence to happen. So basically, in a nutshell, roll 2 dice on your turn. One represents how much work you've done towards the task you want, and the other represents whether you get a consequence or not. And that's the 2 main rules for night.
Cool. So you roll them both at the same time, and then you know the outcome, either success or failure, and the consequence, if any, of that.
You got it.
Simple enough. And then you have the Fief. What am I saying here? I'm in Canada. What do you say in Australia?
I always say Fief, but I could be wrong.
So you have the Fief phase.
So the Fief phase. So Fief is every night, every family, every night that your players have, they own a fief, which is a land holding. It's got about 200 odd peasants on it, and you've got your family. They also live there. Now the Fief phase goes through a number of different steps, but every one of them is basically involved with storytelling in some way. So after your adventure is done, so the first phase is that adventure phase, that quest phase, as I call it. All of your nights, like a traditional adventure, you go out, you save an innocent from a dragon or whatever the problem might happen to be, and then you return back to your Fief phase. And the Fief phase represents a year passing. Now, I stole that idea straight out of Pendragon. It's a great idea, and I'm going to keep it. So a whole year passes between your main night's quests. And what that Fief phase represents is all of those little bits and little stories that happen in that time. So you go through the different steps. And this is drawing back to that story seed idea that I told you about earlier. What happens here is that people start picking members of their family. So at character creation, you actually create 2 members of your family who are your heir and your spare. And in the Fief phase, you start telling stories about them, not just your stories, because your story was that main quest phase that you spent a lot of time on. This whole phase idea I took out of the Forged in the Dark type of stuff anyway. But then you start telling stories about them. So you'll pick your heir. So let's say that your heir is your sister, and you roll something like monster. You also roll a luck die to see, generally speaking, whether it's a good event or a bad event, and you pick another player's NPCs to be involved, and you invite them along on this situation. And so a player in their mind now has a story seed of monster. Let's say they roll a 1, terrible luck, and and somebody else is involved. So with those 3 ideas, that player will go, right, well, my sister went out to slay the horrible troll of Arden Mill, and what they do there. And so then they will, going back to that world map, that shared creation, they will draw that troll then on the map. And I'll say, well, how did your night fare? So you rolled a 1, it was terrible luck. Tell me the story of that. And they'll say, okay, well, I think what's happened is we went in there, I tried to be noble and glorious and win lots of reputation by slaying this troll. And what happened was I got my leg horribly broken, and my friend over here had to drag me out. Okay, sure. And that's one player's turn for one of the parts of the Fief phase. And so we've now got a person, so that sister now has a limp for the rest of their life and a connection with this other person's character that builds on those stories. And so After that minute or so is done, we move to the next player and the next player. They all tell a little story about their family members, and that's the first part of the Fief phase. The second part is pretty simple. It's the same thing, except the GM just like smashes you personally with a choice about your Fief. So it might be a whole collection of pagans want to have a ritual here in your lands, but the true faithful are against them. What are you going to say happens on your land? Something like that. So it's forcing the player to make a sort of a larger scale choice about what happens in the Fief. And finally, there's the Fief phase also has upgrades. So to your characters, you roll for advancement. That's pretty simple. And the last part of it is cheers. So at the very last part, we role play a scene where everybody's sitting around in a feast and they all have to cheer all of their fellow knights and other people for the glorious deeds that they've heard about the other people doing, and they all have to say huzzah.
So you're bringing in a little bit of LARPing into the environment.
A little bit of role playing, mainly because it's just a celebration of the other players' achievements, and I really like bringing those players in to support each other, especially as the game can get a little bit political the longer it goes on, because as you've got up on the screen there, it does go on for multiple years. Each night has about 10 years of adventure in them, and then you've got a time skip, and then you play another character. You play the heir of that first character. So that could be the brother of the previous one, or it could be literally their son or daughter or whatever.
Do you have anything where there's like backstabbing, like heirs that are trying to claim the throne ahead of time or anything like that? Any kind of mechanics to that effect?
Not mechanics for it, other than the story seed. So what happens? So example would be family or romance. So in my story seeds, I have plugged in deliberately a number of words that might lead to that idea. So if you have multiple heirs, if the story seeds that you have generated would indicate that is the case, then you just narrate that happening. Is it because at the end of the day, the goal of the game is to tell a legend of all of these things, and if your characters are fighting each other, if your heirs are fighting each other, you have managed to create an interesting narrative. So you have managed to do that. You're always going to have a knight to be able to play out your quests. That's always going to be the case. Even if that first one dies, or if you've got two heirs, you're playing one, and they get offed by their brother or something, then now you play that treacherous brother. So that's kind of the deal from that. Oh, and one last thing. All of the players, after telling the stories about their family, about their land, they all now tell stories about all of Avalon, which is the fantasy land that they're on. And they're the ones who add stuff to the game. So the players might be like, well, I think there's a barbarian chief over on these islands over here, and they're sending raiders over. We go, great, draw that in on the map. And someone else says something else, and someone else says something else. So that map gets filled up with potential adventures that your knights then will have to deal with. Otherwise, they get worse. But,
well, it's a little bit like the Quiet Year, where you're joining the map together and collectively drawing the map. Do you have like the rules and mechanics for what the paper and all that should look like, or is it just kind of a little bit more freewheely?
There's some guidelines for it. So basically, it's a piece of paper. Usually, I use A3. I don't know, just a largish piece of paper, and I've got some guidelines for how to start the map off, and where where the important NPCs and so on start with, and how to add to the land from there. Yeah. So there are some guides, but it's not as detailed as the Quiet Year, which is a great game, I might say. I haven't actually played it, only read it and desperately wanted to play it. But it definitely has elements of that, adding sort of concepts to the map that tell that story.
Actually, I happen to ironically have a Quiet Year here.
Oh.
I was just actually flipping through it, so it reminded me of that. So,
oh no.
Well, so that looks kind of fun, though. Like you're creating basically a kingdom and all the political intrigue and the conflict, but
not all at once.
Not all at once.
over the years. So, there's no heavy front end loading of it is the other thing, because I think players could get a bit bored if they're all just like, let's all smash this out. Microscope, which is a game you may have heard of, sort of is another one of those inspiring documents for me for how to get that different stories over time.
And then, so you are now on Kickstarter, as we talked about. There's the links here, but I'll put them in the show notes and make sure they're in. We've got your social handle there on Twitter, and you're also on Armored Gaming on Facebook. But just walk us through, this is already now the second edition. So you've got a first edition. What have you kind of brought into the new edition?
So the new edition has about 40 more pages than the original edition. The rules are very similar. There aren't any major changes. I have rewritten them for a little bit of clarity, but what I've added in the new edition is just improvements in layout and a lot more art than what the first one had. But also, towards the end of the book, there's some play guides, structures on how to run the game through, what that looks like. I've added quite a lot to the lore of Avalon. Most of which I've taken actually from playtesting. The magic system in the game, while everyone's plays knights, that's their main characters, magic is a possibility that your knights might be able to be involved in, but it's not it's not and never has been sort of that Dungeons and Dragons like shiny lights magic. It's usually subtle, and it's usually to do with basically the basic idea would be something like, luck doesn't exist. There's only the spirits and so on, and angels and whatnot, saints, that affect the world in some way. So you don't think, I've had good luck because I found 3 coins. No, a spirit sorted it out, so these 3 coins were there for you at that time. That sort of idea. So it's a lot more subtle and a lot more mystical in terms of you need if they're doing magic. So I've added a few pages on what magic looks like in the setting, because a lot of people were really interested in more magical sort of stuff, and so I've detailed that out a lot more than what it was. It was fairly short, and now it's a good couple of pages, and just add a lot more to the lore, a lot more to the background, so people can, and a lot more on the different the main 2 different faiths that show up, and finally just an understanding of the equipment of a knight. So because it's a little bit more low fantasy sort of than traditional D&D, an understanding of what weapons do and can do is actually an assistance to role playing it out, to understanding those choices that you might make in combat, or and so on, and what armor that you're actually wearing, and just to have a good understanding of that, I think is very helpful to the concept of playing knights.
Well, that all sounds like super exciting. I know that you've already achieved your funding goal. You still have a week left to go. So support your indie game designers like Mark, who is doing some incredible work, and everybody should get out there and back it. And so, Mark, I just want to say thank you for coming on the show and sharing a little bit about Night 2nd Edition.
Thanks very much, Gary.
And if you are an indie game designer and you want to share your game just like Mark did today, go to daikugames.com/gamepitch, and there's a form that you can fill out there and put in the details, and hopefully we can get you on the show. And if you go there, make sure to tell them that Game Pitch Gary sent you.
Hey friends, are you looking for a game that is not Dungeons or Dragons? Well, we got exactly what you need at Daiku Game Pitch. We got zines, we got OSR, we got adventures. But wait, there's more. We got solo games, we got journaling games, we even got card games and dice games. Oh hell, I don't even know what kind of game this is, but we got it. And if you visit us in the next 2 minutes, you're gonna get all the Zine Quest, Zine Months, Itch Fund and Backer Kits, Kickstarters that you can't handle. Visit us at www.daikugames.com and tell them Game Pitch Gary sent ya.